Who was the late Queen's favourite Prime Minister, and was she really a Remainer?
Valentine Low joins us on the Daily Tea to discuss his new book, Power and the Palace.
And I am going to be telling an extraordinary story about how Prince Charles was once humiliated at a dinner party by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Later on that evening, Charles tells a story about going to Australia. And he'd been flying Qantas, and the stewardess had said to him, "Oh, right, you're Prince of Wales here. Does that mean you're going to be king one day?" Yes, Charles, yes. And the stewardess says, "Well, that's a pretty scary thought." And then Charles turns to all these ministers and says, "Yes, I suppose it is rather scary, isn't it?" At which point, Dennis Healey, and I think you have to imagine here Eric Morecambe, Morecambe wife, Dennis Healey leans across the table to Charles, chucks him on the cheeks and says, "Well, you shouldn't have joined then."
Valentine Low joins us in the studio with his new book, Power and the Palace, the inside story of the monarchy and 10 Downing Street. It's like a little reunion for us, isn't it, Val?
Isn't it just?
Because for many years, you and I spent a lot of time behind a rope, being told to wait for royals to arrive and then writing up what they did.
Yes, wasn't it exciting?
Wasn't it? Also, Val was like at the head of the royal reporter hierarchy because he was the pool captain. He was the one who would dole out the different royal jobs.
Abroad.
Abroad.
I was foreign pool captain, not domestic.
Indeed. And then I was always a little bit of a thorn in the daily side because I'd be on the Sunday scraping around for exclusives, which would then annoy the dailies if I got anything. And could I be in the pool and could I not be in the pool? And it's a little bit of a nest of vipers, isn't it?
Oh, it
the
was
royal
terrible
press
times.
pack,
Some people, I always tried to be very accommodating as much as I could. Other colleagues who won't be named now were less welcoming.
Indeed, and they will say that recollections may vary about the pool. So you were initially at the Evening Standard, then at the Times. Now you're writing books. You previously came out with Courtiers. This is your follow-up book. And let's just talk about the two top headlines.
Yeah.
First of all,
Queen Camilla.
Queen Camilla was groped as a young woman and had to fight off her attacker with a high-heeled shoe.
I mean, it's an extraordinary story, this. Extraordinary for many reasons, one of which is it's waited until now for it to come out.
Yes.
I was told it, and I can say this because it was on the record, it was an on-the-record conversation by Guido Harry, former BBC correspondent, later went into the other side, PR. He used to do comms for Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London, and later he did a stint at 10 Downing Street when Boris was Prime Minister. But I was talking to Guido about Boris's time as Mayor and his early meetings with the royal family. And he had a meeting with Charles, which didn't go wonderfully. It didn't go terribly, but he and Gita were late because, I mean, idiotically, they'd got on the wrong tube at City Hall.
Of course they did. Yes. It's A to B, so they ended up at C.
Exactly. So they sort of got off the tube 2 stations later, turned around, came back a bit late. And I don't think that went down terribly well with Charles. Anyway, but Camilla was frightfully keen on meeting Boris. And she said to Charles, "Oh, he looks such fun. Can we have him for tea?" So Boris, accompanied by Gita, goes over to Clarence's house for tea. They cycle this time because they're not taking any risks with the tube. And they get there, and Camilla's astonished. They come by bicycle. She'd been told this, but she has to go down to the bike shed to actually check that it's true. Anyway, so she whisks Boris off for tea. Gita has tea with the private secretary. And Boris and Camilla obviously get on like a house on fire.
Of course. You can imagine that, can't
you?
you?
Can't you just? Yeah. I'm sure they're both very, very good company in a way, whatever you think of Boris, good company. And, you know, amidst their chat, they have a serious conversation because Boris is interested in setting up some rape crisis centres around London, and sexual violence, domestic abuse, 2 subjects that Camilla has campaigned on. And she tells him this story, which involves her as a young teenage schoolgirl going to London on the train, and someone gropes her, and we don't know the details. We don't need to know the details. Obviously, an unpleasant experience for anyone, let alone a sort of young schoolgirl. And Boris says, "Well, what did you do? What happened?" And Camilla says, "Well, I did what my mother taught me. I took my shoe off and whacked him in the nuts with a heel."
Excellent.
But in a way, what I love about the story is that when they get to London, she has got the presence of mind to go and find someone in uniform and the groper's arrested.
Brilliant.
Which
would not happen today.
Good luck finding a policeman.
But when you ran that by Buckingham Palace, because often we get obstructed if we want to report on very personal matters, let's be honest, they were okay with that.
Well, obviously I spoke to Buckingham Palace, of course I did.
Yes.
And the risk of sounding monumentally pompous, I can't possibly divulge the details of the conversation, but suffice it to say, we published.
Yes.
And there haven't been any complaints in the palace yet. And I'm given to understand that Camilla, the Queen, Her Majesty the Queen, has got a kind of pragmatic attitude to the whole thing, that although she's never chosen to make this public herself, for I think perhaps good reasons, she thinks that if, by it being discussed now, women and girls who might have been subjected to some sort of attack see that there's no stigma or shame attached to it, and if that makes it easier for them to talk about it, then that's a positive.
And that it's depressingly normal.
Yeah, it was too common then, too common now.
Exactly. So the Queen got on well with Boris, but the previous Queen, you have revealed, might not have approved of Brexit.
That's right. This was extraordinary. I was quite taken aback with this, because we all remember that during the Brexit referendum campaign, there was a front page story in The Sun. Headline, Queen backs Brexit.
Which was based on what?
Well, it was based on a conversation at a lunch at Windsor Castle a few years earlier, at which the Queen allegedly said, "I just don't understand the EU." And apparently she said this with, quotes, venom and emotion, close quotes. The Sun got into trouble with the press regulator about this, because they ruled, I think a lot of people would agree correctly, that the headline was not justified by the evidence in the copy.
No.
But anyway, the idea was set in the nation's head that the Queen was basically in favour of Brexit. Occasionally some clues would surface. She'd wear a hat that seemed to be in EU colours, and everyone got very excited, but we don't know. Angela Kelly, who was responsible for the Queen's hats, said, no, nothing to do with it. It's pure coincidence. Who knows? I certainly don't know. And then I was talking to a minister who said that some 3 months or so before the Brexit referendum, they'd been talking to the Queen, and the Queen had said, "I don't think we should leave the EU." And the Queen went on to say, "Better stick with the devil you know." Now, I don't think this means the Queen was a rampant advocate of the EU.
And that could be interpreted as quite a conservative sentiment and a small c.
Well, I think she was a small c conservative. Yeah. I think she didn't want to rock the boat. But there's no doubt she was sceptical about some aspects of the EU. I mean, I think that she, thought that some of the bureaucracy was exasperating, but in general, I think she saw institutions like the EU as part of the kind of post-war settlement after two world wars, unity and cooperation amongst nations. That's broadly how she saw things. I think she was a reluctant Remainer, as so many people were.
You see, I'm going to pick a bone with you about this.
Okay.
I do agree with you, and actually you think about her, she was a fluent French speaker. Obviously, she watched her parents' extremely close collaboration with Winston Churchill and would very much be interested in sort of post-World War II European solidarity. But on the other hand, I've spoken to several very senior politicians who have always insisted that the Queen and Prince Philip were Brexiteers, but that the King and Prince William were Remainers. Now, that could just have been a generational observation. I also heard, which we can now speak about, we couldn't at the time that she was alive, that she did express some political dissent at the hunting ban during the Blair years. Now, that's not going to surprise anybody at this table, but I was always led to believe that she was more of a Leaver than a Remainer.
Right. I mean, all I can say is that, well, A, the evidence of my own conversation, but also Dominic Lawson wrote a piece the other day in the Daily Mail in which he said he'd spoken to someone close to the Queen who said there's no way she supported Brexit. Who knows? These things surface. All I can say is the person I spoke to had a direct conversation with the Queen and quoted her. Are they telling the truth? I've got no reason to disbelieve them. No. And one thing that gets said in this context is that, the Queen didn't express political opinions. Now, you've suggested that actually there were occasions she did. And I think, although she could be pretty gnomic and she could be guarded with her opinions, I mean, I for instance, I think Malcolm Rifkin told me that, he was never aware of her expressing a political opinion in his company. But she was more prepared to express opinions than perhaps we give her credit for.
Yes.
I mean, one politician told me of a time that he was at a relatively informal occasion with the Queen, having drinks with the Queen, and the subject came up of a forthcoming visit to or from Pakistan and General Musharraf, and she said, "Isn't he just a crook? Isn't he completely corrupt?" I mean, they were absolutely agog, and their jaws hit the ground. And one of them, in a sort of desperate, they didn't know what to say.
Yeah.
And one of them, in an attempt to change the subject, turned it to racing, and asked about, did she watch did she like Channel 4's racing coverage? Did she watch their morning preview program, The Morning Line? And the Queen said she loved Channel 4's racing coverage, thought it was excellent, but she couldn't watch the Morning Line because she couldn't stand John McCurrick.
Not sure if she's alone in that view either.
I'm not sure she is.
One thing I really want to ask you, with a sort of historian's hat on, is because the book is about the relationship between the Crown and Number 10. Is the way Elizabeth II did it unique to Elizabeth II? We've been talking about diplomacy and keeping your opinions to yourself. Is that something she was actually unusual in doing? And because she was on the throne for so long, we've got used to the idea that that's the way monarchs behave. But actually, that was more about Elizabeth II.
I think
than
you're
monarchy.
absolutely correct, because I start the book with Victoria,
Yeah.
and Victoria, of course, was incredibly political. She tried to influence who became prime minister.
She campaigned against vivisection and animal testing.
Yeah, she gave
thing
money.
I love about
she
Victoria.
gave money through one of her aides to the Whigs in a general election. She tried to get Lord Palmerston sacked as foreign secretary. Yeah. The list is endless. So she was incredibly political. And other politicians, other sovereigns definitely had opinions. I mean, George V was an out-and-out Tory, and Lloyd George hated him for it. He used to complain about the Tory atmosphere in the palace. And even George VI, definitely on the conservative end of the spectrum. I mean, he had a good relationship with Clement Attlee, who became the Labour Prime Minister in 1945, but he definitely had, in private, things to say about some of government policy. And I think there's an interesting contrast, which I pick up on the book, is that in 1945, when Winston Churchill loses the election immediately after the end of the war, George VI is so upset with this that he writes to Churchill not once but twice, saying how sorry he is to see him go. And the Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, also tells George VI how sorry tells Churchill, how sorry she is to see him go. You go forward 25 years. Harold Wilson, who had a very good relation, one of the best relationships of Queen Elizabeth's reign with her prime ministers. 1970, he loses the election, and he writes that he thinks the Queen is very sorry to see him go, probably with some justification, but then adds, but obviously she cannot say so. I mean, that word obviously carries a lot of weight there, and it's fascinating that in the mere 25 years it's gone from that king happily to write to a prime minister and say sorry to Harold Wilson is just assuming you couldn't possibly do that.
Yeah, even with a book as packed with anecdotes as this is and great stories, we're still in the business of trying to infer from this mysterious woman what she thought.
Yes,
it's not like with previous monarchs or necessarily with this one, where you can reasonably guess what they think. And
yes,
I wonder sometimes if Charles is a return to the way things were before Elizabeth II. People keep criticising Charles for being outspoken on certain subjects, but actually there's a case for saying his mother was the extraordinary one. He's just what monarchs are like.
Yeah, but what's interesting is how Charles has changed his way of operating. I mean, yes, the Queen, we knew virtually nothing about what she thought, what she believed. Charles, we know everything. We know exactly what he thinks on practically every subject under the sun. But he signalled before he became king. He signalled that he was going to change his ways. And he has. What was interesting is that on accession to the throne, he made about 3 or 4 speeches in a few days, and in every single one of them he referenced the Constitution, and that was his way of signalling that he was going to be a good constitutional king. And he's done it. So he doesn't make controversial speeches anymore. He doesn't write letters that anger ministers anymore, but he does things in a kind of subtle way. So the example I always like to bring up is the reception that he had at Buckingham Palace for people from the Windrush generation. As Prince of Wales, he had commissioned portraits of, I can't remember, 10 or so people from the Windrush generation. And then when they were finished, he has a reception, so all these people are invited. And it was his way, particularly in the wake of the Windrush scandal about how these people were treated by the Home Office, it was his way of signalling that these people are very important to this country and their contribution is welcomed and to be valued. So he does things in a different way. But one of the interesting things I always found about Charles is that he said, so in this documentary marking his 70th birthday, he said, he was basically asked, are you going to be a meddling king like you've been a meddling prince? And he says, of course not. I'm not stupid. I know the difference. But the question then is, well, what is the difference? No one defines it. No one says princes of Wales can do this, monarchs can do that. And I think basically he defined it. He made up his rules as he went along. And it was merely a question of whether he got away with it. And I think there's a really interesting incident, which I don't claim to reveal. It's in Peter Mandelson's memoirs, but I think no one's ever really focused on it. During the Blair years, GM food becomes an issue. Charles writes a piece for the Daily Mail. It's very inflammatory. I think probably the headline was more inflammatory than the copy, but it goes down extremely badly with the government. And Blair tells Peter Mandelson, who has a relationship with Charles, he's got to lay off, he's got to tone it down. So Mandelson rings Charles on his car phone from a traffic jam in New York and basically says he's going to back off. And, Mandelson says, well, I don't think he changed his views as a result of that conversation, but he did quieten down a bit. And I think that's an incredibly important conversation because it's one of the few times that we know about where the government has told the royal family, no, enough, you've got to be quiet.
Tell us about the extraordinary interaction between a then quite young Prince of Wales and Dennis Healey.
I love this story so much. So Charles is in his late 20s. Jim Callaghan is Prime Minister, and Charles wants to know more about what he calls statecraft. He wants to know about how the whole governmental machine works. So Jim Callaghan sets up this dinner at Chequers with lots of ministers present, including Dennis Healey, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And Dennis Healey had been a member of the Communist Party in his youth. And Charles says to him, being an ex-communist, has that made your job more difficult? And Dennis Healey is kind of rather annoyed with this. He thinks this is a naive, stupid question. And he patiently explains to Charles that, when Healey was young, fascism had been a real danger and people were very concerned. So they reacted accordingly. Later on that evening, Charles tells a story about going to Australia. And he'd been flying Qantas, and the stewardess had said to him, oh, right, you're Prince of Wales, yeah. Does that mean you're going to be king one day? And, yes, Charles, yes. And the stewardess says, well, that's a pretty scary thought. And then Charles turns to all these ministers and says, well, yes, I suppose it is rather scary, isn't it? At which point, Dennis Healey, and I think you have to imagine here Eric Morecambe, Morecambe was, Dennis Healey leans across the table to Charles, chucks him on the cheeks and says, well, you shouldn't have joined then.
The cheek of it.
I think that's wonderful. And I think it's great that we live in a country where you can do that.
Yes. Can you now?
Yeah, I think you probably still could. It's a question of, is Charles capable of taking a joke on him like that?
I think he probably is. He's perfectly capable of standing on his dignity on occasion.
Yes.
But perhaps he could see the joke then.
Right.
I say that hesitatingly.
It strikes me when we read about the different relationships that the late Queen had with her very many prime ministers, that it's less about ideology and just more about personality. And we've seen that. We have a regard for her having a very close relationship, for instance, with Ronald Reagan, and we think about them both being on horseback outside the White House. And then you and I, Val, directly reported on the visit by the Obamas, many visits by the Obamas, and we saw up close and personal that sort of bond that they seemed to strike up, particularly when it came to the Queen and Michelle Obama.
Yes.
And it's at that point that you sort of look at state visits and think, this is just about whether or not you get on. And that brings us back to Wilson and things. I mean, actually, she got on with prime ministers that you perhaps might have thought on the surface she wouldn't get on with, and didn't get on with prime ministers you thought she might.
What's interesting is that politics has nothing to do with it. The Queen was once asked if she'd had more Labour or Conservative prime ministers, and she said, "Do you know what? I don't know," because that's not what she paid attention to. So she got on obviously well with Harold Wilson and Winston Churchill, and there were the tricky ones we know about. Edward Heath, awkward, no small talk. Margaret Thatcher, been written about a lot. That I think it was an awkward relationship. I think the Queen was exasperated by Margaret Thatcher. I don't think they hated each other. I think it's silly. That's going too far.
That was blown up by the Crown, wasn't it?
It was certainly blown up.
An actual philosophical difference.
Yeah, but there were differences, and then others we don't know about so well. I mean, I was fascinated to discover that the Queen thought Harold Macmillan was a bit of a bore, and he used to lecture her rather pompously. And although no one has spelled this out, I think she had a very good relationship with John Major. John Major is a very warm, empathetic man. He's someone on a personal level who you'd go to in times of trouble, and we saw that a bit in the Charles and Diana years when he was very much as an honest broker with them, not to try and solve anything, not to kind of stop this breakup or anything like that, but just to kind of try and smooth things, trying to make it happen in a more satisfactory way. And the Queen afterwards appointed Major the chairman of her Diamond Jubilee Trust, and I think that shows that she had a lot of time. And he would periodically see her. She might call him in for a chat about something. So I think people don't realise, I think she had a good relationship with John Major.
They nicknamed him the On John.
That was Diana, yes. Diana called him the On John, yeah.
I find that very surprising because even though I grew up with him, he doesn't really exist in my memory. I think I'd have to be hypnotised to recover any memories of John Major having been Prime Minister, and it turns out he was a lovely man.
I mean, he exists in my memory in spitting image,
very grey,
painted grey,
peas.
and asking more peas,
More peas, Norma.
And of course, he was an ardent Remainer and remains an ardent Remainer.
Yes, very much so. Yes,
and we can trace back some of the Tory party's own sort of deep psychosis to Major and the Maastricht rebels. But I digress. Can we move on just because you are the man who broke the bullying dossier story concerning Harry and Meghan when you were at the Times, to speaking about the Sussexes?
Yes.
Where are you on the Sussexes these days? We've just had another intervention from Meghan on sending your children into school with a little note in their lunchbox, Tim, even if they're preschoolers and can't read. She suggests that you should send your child in with a boiled egg.
Right.
I think covered in a floral flourish that's been foraged from the back garden. I mean, in my mind, if you're a child who takes a boiled egg into school and starts peeling it in a classroom, you're not going to be popular with your classmates. But
you may not know this, I was also the reporter who was present, because it was my turn to do a rota, when Meghan, when she was still in the system, visited a support centre for prostitutes in, I think, Bristol, and these people were preparing packed meals for these streetwalkers, and there were bananas. And Meghan, I watched this happen, Meghan said, "Oh, I've got an idea. Has anyone got a Sharpie?" And someone went to go and get a Sharpie, not quite understanding what this was for. And Meghan started writing messages on the bananas for these prostitutes. We love you, we support you, you're strong, you're beautiful. It was one of the most
this is not a new thing. She's been playing with her food her whole life. But what do the notes say in the packed lunch?
I'm not quite sure, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
And if they can't read them, do you just
I mean,
pay someone to read it to the child?
possibly.
Because
But
they have that kind
Maybe,
of money.
but it's much parodied. I suppose it's an extraordinary set of circumstances, Val, that when this American actress emerged on the scene circa 2016, and then they got engaged and married in 2018, and now we're where we are, and Megxit's happened, and she is now being sort of widely lampooned on social media, despite her efforts to self-fund and frankly live an independent, non-royal life in Montecito. I don't know whether we knew we would end up here, did we?
No, I don't. And it's a funny situation. I mean, they're trying to make their own way in the world, and I wish them all the best for that. I really do. I mean, I quite happily not hear from them ever again, and I don't want to watch her television program. But if they want to make it, and if someone wants to watch it, that's fine by me. The problem is, Meghan always thinks she's the smartest person in the room, which is not an accusation ever levelled at Harry, but. And she thinks she can be a wonderful broadcaster in terms of, executive producer. And so far, we haven't seen that. Not really. I mean, obviously, they had that incredible documentary series where they, unburdened their life and their opinions. But nothing since has convinced me that they've got a great career in the media industry. So I kind of wonder how all this is going to pan out. I always think that, Harry would have been best off going to work on a game park in southern Africa or somewhere like that. That's where we had been happy.
And he said that in his memoir. He hinted at that in his memoir, and he was at his happiest on safari.
Exactly. And that obviously, and he would have been far from the public eye. I think Harry would love to be far from the public eye. That, of course, is not Meghan's vision. So she's where they are where she wants to be. I'm not sure they are where he wants to be.
Sarah Palin once suggested that she thought that the Queen actually ran Britain. And I think Americans do still have an old-fashioned idea of the role of monarchy in British public life. But isn't one of the ironies of the system, which Meghan wouldn't understand, that actually royals have to know their place?
Well, but what's interesting about that, Europeans think that too.
Right.
So the Queen once gave a talk at a college in London, and she was with some students. Peter Hennessy, the great historian and sort of commentator, was accompanying her, was her host, and they was talking about the Constitution, and she said, of course, they don't understand the Constitution, and Maastricht was a thing at the time, and apparently some German foreign minister said to the Queen when she was in Germany, "Can't you just get under Parliament and order it through?" And it was an absolutely extraordinary thing to say.
Yeah.
That this idea that this very senior German politician thought she could do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do we think that William will make a good king, Val?
I think he will. He thinks about it very seriously. He's different from his father. He's tried very hard not to tread on political toes. But he's also quite stubborn. I think on balance he will make a good king. But there was an interesting occasion around Boris, prorogation, Brexit, all that, when Boris got the Queen to prorogue Parliament, suspend Parliament so he could get Brexit through, this was overturned by the Supreme Court. William thought this was very bad. William was very angry. He thought the Queen had been badly advised. He thought the whole episode had embarrassed the Queen. And he let it be known privately that when he was on the throne, there would be more robust challenging of advice. Now, advice in that context, it's not advice as you and I understand it. When the Prime Minister advises the sovereign to do something, that's it. That's basically an instruction. They can't say no. So the idea that William wants to robustly challenge advice is a very interesting idea. I put it to someone extremely senior in Whitehall, and they said, you just have to think about it for 30 seconds and realise that's an incredibly stupid thing to say. Now, whether William was talking in the heat of the moment, whether he'd spoken to his advisors about that sort of thing, I don't know. My guess is, and it's a pure guess, is that he might have rode back from that a bit. But if he hasn't, and if he does start robustly challenging advice, we may be in for interesting times ahead.
Do you think William has his father's hinterland? Because one thing I really like about Charles is his love of literature, Wagner, Welsh harps. I recently went to Dumfries House, which he helped to save by organising a loan. That's one of the things royals can do that people don't appreciate. They can get people to invest in things and bail things out. And there are now hundreds of people at that estate working on traditional arts and crafts. Charles really loves tradition and custom, and he's a very intellectual, spiritual man. I look at William and I just think helicopters. Am I wrong? Is there a side to William I don't see?
I think you're right. I don't think William has anything like the same hinterland as his father. And this makes itself manifest in interesting ways, because I think his advisors, when they want to tell him about something, I think they tend to give him an oral briefing. He doesn't like reading papers. And one of the questions just appealed to me. I wanted to find out if he'd read his Bagehot. Walter Bagehot, the great Victorian writer on the Constitution, author of the English Constitution, which we still refer to today.
It's the Dummy's Guide to Parliament of the 19th century, isn't it?
Exactly. Every monarch, Victoria didn't read it, Victoria didn't approve of Bagehot, but every monarch since, as far as I understand, has read their Bagehot. They've had some tutor or whatever in their adolescence has told them about Bagehot, and they've sat down to read him. William has been told about Bagehot. I don't believe, from the conversations I've had, that he's actually read it.
Right.
Also, has he read his Bible? He doesn't seem to do God, and I'm wondering if that's problematic moving forward.
I think that's an incredibly good point. It's something which doesn't get discussed very often, but he's going to be Supreme Governor of the Church of England, and does he go to church? Not much.
Does that worry you, Tim?
Well, it doesn't bother me as a Catholic, of course. But he is going to have to sit through a lot of church services, including when he is coronated. And I wonder, I was there for that. I had a beautiful view behind a big stone pillar.
Like most journalists.
Like most of the journalists, of course. I had to come home and immediately watch it on telly in order to write about it. Did Charles want that kind of lavish coronation?
Well, the coronation's interesting. So Buckingham Palace, they've been planning, Charles's people have been planning the coronation for ages, but in a kind of broad brush way, while he was still Prince of Wales. He accedes to the throne, and it's a cost of living crisis, and they're very aware of this. They're very aware of image. They're very aware of how things go down. And they put their plans, or a range of plans, to the government. And a senior minister told me that what they were suggesting was what this minister described as a royal wedding plus. And the government said, no, I think you ought to go full fat. Don't be stupidly lavish, but we think you could do more of a proper job than that. So the palace had the go-ahead to do more of a full coronation than they had been anticipating.
But we won't have that for William.
No, we've read that he will have a different plan, but we don't know what that means. In the same way that we've read his will be a different reign, but we don't really know what that means.
See, I'm worried it's going to look like a civil union in a hotel.
Depends which hotel it's in, though.
It could be a very nice hotel.
I mean, if it's the Goring, it's fine. If it's the Premier Inn, perhaps less so.
I think it's the showmanship of monarchy that adds to its value.
What we like some ermine. We like some pomp and
ceremony. I know they're bored of it because they have to sleep in it. I get it. They're bored of it.
But we like seeing it.
The public like to see it all brought out, like the nice chime.
And I always think that lots of people don't want to, but the people who watch do want to see it. So half the population can not turn on their telly on the day of the coronation, and that's fine. And who cares what they think about the lavishness? But the people who watch it want a spectacle.
Didn't get where we are today with cut price coronations. Valentine Low, the author of Power and the Palace, which is out now. We've got some Telegraph book deal on it, actually, which we will put in our show notes, won't we, John? The producer's nodding at me. Thank you very much for joining us on the Daily Tea.
Thank you for having me.